Hi everyone, in just a second I'm going to be introducing author Joy Jordan Lake, and we're going to be talking about her newest book, A Tangled Mercy, which came out in November 1st. So it's been a little bit, but her and I have tried to schedule this back and forth, and finally I get to talk to her, and I'm so happy. I love this book so much. Historical fiction. I love historical fiction, and this is dual timelines from present back to 1822. It's an amazing story. I can't wait to hear. Wait till you hear how she came up with the story. It's crazy. So I will get her to tell you. Everyone, here is Joy. Hi everyone, I am so excited because I'm speaking with author Joy Jordan Lake, and we're going to be talking about her latest book called A Tangled Mercy, and she's got it right there, the copy of the book. There it is, yes. And I was so excited because we have been trying to get this together for a while. So finally, I was like, finally. That's why today I was like, no, we're doing this interview today. Like, it's happening.
Let's do it in our cars. Yeah.
Yes, if we had to, it was going to happen. Because I read this book a while ago, and then I just kind of reread it again, to freshen up on it. And I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder I wanted to do this interview because it was such a good book. And I love historical fiction. I mean, that is my thing. Okay. And I get a lot of grief for it. People are like, oh, you like so much historical fiction. Yes, I do. So that's just how it is. But anyway, I love this story. And what I love the most is your story about how you found this story. So I want you to tell everybody because it's truly an incredible story. It really is.
Thanks, Michelle. It is a very odd story for sure. It started more than 20 years ago, and it was in my head supposed to be my first book. I wasn't even thinking. I'd always wanted to write novels since I was a kid, about fifth grade. That's another story. But I was actually working on my doctoral dissertation, and I was in the libraries, deep in the archives, and huge stacks of books that nobody had checked out through interlibrary loan for literally sometimes 100 years. I was like, these dusty books, and came across several things that I'd never heard of before. One was the Denmark VC slave revolt. Never heard of it before. And I'd grown up in the South, and I've read a lot of history and, studied history. Never heard of it. 1822. And then the Grimke sisters. Never heard of them in South Carolina. White abolitionist sisters in Charleston. And this was before Sue Kid's beautiful book, and I didn't even know anybody who'd ever heard of Angelina or Sarah Grimke. And I just kept coming across these things that I was fascinated by, and so I began to make notes for a novel, even though I was supposed to be writing this doctoral dissertation. So I was so fascinated that I talked my husband into driving in our little Dodge Colt down to Charleston from Boston. About 1,000 miles with our 8-month-old baby in the back. And, and we had like zero money. So we had to find a place to stay that was 50 cents a night or something. And
wow.
We did research. And in my head, this was March of 1996. And in my head, I would just write this novel in about 4 months, do the research, write it fast. My husband had a college roommate who'd been to a cocktail party with a big dog, literary agent. So I thought, great, I'll love to have me, unknown writer, and it'll be super. And then I'll land a literary agent, we'll get it published, and I'll get back to the dissertation before my advisor even knows I'm gone. And of course, it didn't work that way at all. It was slow researching because I was so fascinated, and finally, after actually several years, put together a long historical novel, well over 500-600 pages long, and it just kept getting editors and agents interested in it. It was kind of an almost over and over again, and it just wouldn't quite get picked up, and I was just really frustrated, and did other things, finished the dissertation, finished the degree, wrote other books, a number of other books, had another baby, adopted another baby, taught classes. Life went on. Years went by, And then about 5 years ago, I completely rewrote it as a contemporary novel where this character named Kate, who was an awful lot like me in graduate school, she was kind of floundering, didn't know what she really wanted out of this PhD she was getting, and just kind of a sort of a lost soul. And she was doing this research. And so that's how I wove in the history of this slave revolt that was just fascinating. And this character named Tom Russell, who's a historical character who was the weapon maker for the revolt, who originally did not want to be a part of it because he thought they would all be killed. He could look around. He was very much part of the fabric of society in Charleston, very much interwoven with the kind of powerful white ruling class. So he looked around and went, who's got all the armaments, Anyway, and the Grimke sisters. So I wrote it as a contemporary story, straight contemporary. And then a few years ago, then interwove the two stories. I decided the contemporary didn't quite work either because I was having to spend way too much time on the history that Kate was doing. And there was this character named Gabe that I had kind of carried with me for about 20 years. He was about 10 years old, this cute little guy that just kept popping up into my imagination. So anyway, finally interwove these stories and finally got it. I had several agents along the way. Finally got this agent I adored, and she's fabulous in New York, Elizabeth Weed. And she loved the story, but said, there's just a few things I want you to change, and then I'll submit it to this list of editors. We were both excited. It was June of 2015, mid-June, and she said, just make these final changes, send it back to me by the end of the week, and we'll submit it before all the editors go to the Hamptons for the summer. And it was Thursday morning early on June 18th. And I'd been right here in my office, my attic office, making the changes. And my older daughter was home from college. And all of a sudden, I hear her just running down the stairs. I'd slipped down to get some more coffee. And she was just thundering down the stairs, yelling, "Mom, Mom, Mom, something awful has happened in Charleston. Turn on the radio." And we did. And this horrible massacre had taken place the night before at Emmanuel AME. And the bizarre thing was, 20 years back, when I had first started the historical version, a bunch of the chapters were set in this church because it was so central to the history of Charleston and to the Bessie Revolt and the Grimkes. And one of the main characters was named Pinckney, which is the last name of the pastor of the church who was the first one killed in the massacre. And there were just all these tie-ins that, if you hadn't known better, you would have thought I had written the novel after the tragedy and then just forgotten to mention that, oh, by the way, this horrible thing happens in this church and to the city. And it was just, truly, it looked sadistic. There were so many tie-ins and all these chapters that took place at Emmanuel AME and all these characters who were tied in with Emmanuel AME and the Bessie Revolt and the Grimke sisters. And so it was just, sorry, my dog. My dog is tearing things up. So I had got on, talked with my agent, and both of us in tears, and both of us sitting there reading the latest on our phones from the New York Times and trying to keep up with what happened and who did it and had he been caught, and both of us just in tears going back and forth. And both of us agreed this novel was probably unpublishable now because it truly looked horrible. It just, again, it looked like I had some sort of, awful foresight that this was going to happen and wrote this novel. And then finally going back and forth, we both said, at one point I asked her, would you tell me the truth if I tried to work in this tragedy into the story, because it's all there, all the background to why this tragedy happened and why I picked this church and why I picked this city and why I picked these people. What is it about Charleston, that this shooter thought he could start a race war in this city? And it's all there, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I asked my agent, who has a big and compassionate heart, will you tell me the truth? If I try to do this, if it looks at all exploitative, if it looks like, if it looks like I'm trying to sell books based on someone else's tragedy if it looks in any way. What I want to do is try to honor the victims and honor their families and help their names be remembered, and maybe be one tiny piece more to all of us understanding race relations in this country. But please tell me the truth. And she said, listen, I promise you I will, because your name's on it, my name's on it, and
Right.
I promise to tell you the truth. And so she called me. I spent several weeks just in a frenzy, just doing nothing but writing. Sometimes I'd be in Starbucks, and later a friend would say, well, I passed you in Starbucks and your head's like this, over your keyboard, and I didn't dare even say hi. And I just, kind of morning to, dawn to dusk was just pounding away in a frenzy, and wrote it pretty fast. Changed the historical story was almost didn't need to be touched at all, because again, everything was there already. And in the contemporary story, I just wove in the tragedy, and we tried to be very careful not to weave in too much about the shooter himself. We didn't want to in any way say his name or give him any kind of glory or promotion. And I sent it to my agent, and I was at the beach with some girlfriends when she called me back, and she called me crying and said, yeah, this I truly believe this does what you and I both wanted to do, that it honors the people involved, not only in 2015, but in 1822, and all through the years, honors the people of Charleston, and, both the fact that this was a center for slave trading, but also now is a very different place, and anyway, so that's the long story.
No,
and it could be longer.
Yeah, it was so fascinating to read about that. I read it after I had read the book, because it's at the back of the book, and I was my oldest son lived in Charleston during that.
You're kidding.
No. And he's the one that does the editing for this. So I remember it really well because they went to the memorial. There were lines and like forever to get there. And they did. They ended up going, and because they lived in Charleston for a while at that point. They are now in Arizona. But when I was reading about it, I was like, oh, I remember that because, he was there.
You were there.
Yeah. And, what's fascinating to me is like, that was 2015. We're in 2018. I was like, how many have we had since then? Like,
I know.
Like, that was huge because it was in a church, and it was just so, like, horrible, But then I was thinking today when I was doing the research, I was like, isn't it crazy how many we've dealt with since then? Yeah. Right?
It's so true. And it's, when my agent first sent it to a list of editors, some of them said, and this was still 2015. This was fall of 2015. So it was soon thereafter.
Right.
But we said we don't want to publish too soon.
Right.
We want to wait and give some space in there. But even then, at that point, a number of the editors said, I just, even waiting a couple of years, I just feel like it's going to be too soon. And my agent, Elizabeth, and I kept going back and forth saying, are we monsters, or are we looking at it from the angle of, if this were my loved one who was killed, would I want them to be forgotten in this long line, like you say, of just shooting after shooting after shooting? And both of us kept coming back with the answer of, I'd want my mom or my sister or my grandfather, I'd want them remembered, and so we did wait about 2.5 years before it was published. The editor who picked it up did want, like we did, wanted to wait, wanted to give time in there, and I think that was wise. And it was interesting, I think, because of what you said, I was kind of braced for some people, even then, 2.5 years later, to feel like, wow, too soon. But it's interesting, the response has been quite the opposite. It's been more like, I'm so glad to be reminded, because there have been so many shootings. I'm so glad to be reminded of their names and their faces and their lives.
And you list their names in the back of the book. You do list all of their names. But I mean, Charleston is so amazing. I loved it there. I love visiting them there. I didn't spend a whole lot of time there, but every time that I did go down to visit them, I mean, it was just beautiful. and they miss it. They miss it a lot. They've moved because of his job, but my daughter-in-law's like, oh, I miss Charleston. They just really love the community there. So
Yeah.
it's that kind of a place that kind of I think they'll always think of that as their home.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they talk about it all the time. But I want to read this quote, and it is I don't do spoilers, but this is historical fiction. It's a little bit different, but it's got a story, and so we don't talk about it too much. And this was at the back, but it doesn't give away anything. But I just love this quote that you wrote. A life worth living is one of compassion, and a life of compassion will include many tears. I thought that was so good when I read that. I mean, of course, it's like, we take this journey with them, and I love the way you go back and forth, and it was seamless. I mean, it was just perfect. And by the time I got to that, I was just like, yes, it's so good.
So sad about going back and forth, because that was the first dual timeline novel really I ever wrote. My first novel was starts in the present and then goes back to the late 1970s. Also includes some racial issues. It's based loosely on my own hometown and a Sri Lankan family I was friends with, but and then it ends in present day. But this was the first time I'd ever tried to go back and forth in time, and I wanted to jump out a one-story window every day.
Right. But I loved it. I mean, I just thought you did I learned so much. I mean, like you said, I didn't know any of this. I mean, it's not something I learned about in school. So that's what I love about historical fiction, is to bring these stories to light. And, I didn't even know it was a big port until, I shouldn't say, I didn't know it was a big slave port. And, and then I'm like, why didn't we learn that? So we just don't learn that stuff, so it's,
in Charleston, the carriage tours they take, and you can take a carriage ride of the city, and they tell you. And it's been interesting. There's been a shift that I've seen, even though I don't get to live there, which would be lovely. But just in the 20 plus years I've worked on this book, 20 plus years ago, there were still some of the plantation homes that would have like a white young woman in a big hoop skirt, out front. None of that anymore. And now there's a lot more history on the slave culture at these old plantations, and honoring the people who worked there. And so that's been a big shift. And even the carriage tours used to never mention the slave port or where the selling of slaves happened or that kind of thing. And you had to take something like the Gullah tours with Alonzo Brown. He's fabulous. He still does his Gullah tours, to find out more about the African American history. And I've seen that shift. In fact, one of the carriage tours now goes by Emmanuel AME. And one of them, the summer that this happened in 2015, the Grimcase house had no historical marker at all, which is ridiculous. These women were absolute history changers. And now it has a beautiful historical marker out front telling about who they were and what they did. And so that's all good, that sometimes tragedy makes people sit up and go, oh, gosh, we need to talk about this more, not just pretend because we're embarrassed it happened, just pretend it didn't happen,
Right. And, I remember when my son moved there, of course, he grew up in Pennsylvania, and he would tell me, he was like, Mom, they're really like into the South here. Like at first he really didn't understand, he was like trying to understand the history, because here it's not so big,
Right.
It's like, or you don't notice it if you live there, but then having, go there and he was like, no, Charleston, they're like really into their history. Like they celebrate a lot of their history. So, yeah, but he loved it. So, it's beautiful, but anyway, it was such a good book. And I did see, like, you've written so many other interesting books. Okay, Why Jesus Makes Me Nervous. I was like, I have to ask her about that book. Like, I love the title of that.
That came out, I think it came out, it might have come out of my own head, but I think I should probably give my dad, who's no longer living, credit for that. I think it was a conversation he and I were having one time about, kind of what would it look like, what would it look like if you really paid attention to what Jesus really says and not just how it gets filtered through kind of, comfortable church life. And, there's just a lot of really hard things about, how we need to treat refugees and treat how we need to address our own possessions and, just hard stuff that, that, to be honest, most of us as individuals and certainly most churches don't talk about enough. And, so anyway, I kind of wanted to take away some of the, a lot of my friends throughout my life, but especially when I was living in New England, were not people of any particular faith at all. And so I was always kind of the fat lady at the circus, it's like, what? Tell us more about this stuff. I was working in a church up there in New England at the time I was on staff, one of the ministers. And so it was kind of this bizarre, I was going to grad school, but also running the compassion ministries for a church up there. So it was kind of an interesting, what would it, I found a lot of my colleagues, even who weren't people of faith, were very committed to just compassion issues, very big hearted, very much concerned about homelessness and hunger and clean water and, that kind of stuff. And so they were really intrigued with they were happy to come work in a soup kitchen or come work for a party where, underprivileged kids get to come and, so it was kind of heartbreaking to me that sometimes church people, don't do a good job of that. So anyway, that's kind of where that book came from. I tried not to use churchy language and try to think about how do we talk about these things outside the kind of churchy language.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to get it. I want to read it. So what are you, this came out at the beginning of November. What are you working on now?
Now I'm working on a book set in 1895-96 at the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. If you know where that is. Yes. It's the largest private residence in the United States. And it's kind of on the one hand, it's sort of, my agent likes to describe it as the American Downton Abbey sort. So on the one hand, it's sort of that. And even people who just loved the sort of, the great, sort of the dowager quotes from Downton Abbey and all the gorgeous clothes and all. But also, Downton Abbey had a lot of these social issues and, upheaval of women's roles changing drastically and, all that kind of stuff going on. And economic issues, the chauffeur, and all that kind of stuff. So some of it's that kind of thing. I had not realized till I started researching it that because my kids accuse me that what I do is pick a place I want to vacation a lot and then decide I'm going to write.
I think that works, right?
Not the most, scholarly approach, but I just was really drawn to the Biltmore history and great excuse to keep going back to the North Carolina mountains and go hiking. So, but I didn't realize what a time of upheaval the 1890s were. I think that had all kind of dulled in my brain from, high school history or something. But huge time of upheaval in the United States. So that's kind of fascinating too. And George Washington Vanderbilt, the one who built the Biltmore with his fortune, was a fascinating guy because he was really very, very wealthy, inherited several million from his grandfather and father, and but big-hearted, really wanted to help people with education, with being able to start their own businesses. Really wanted to, not just be a hoarder, and he was fascinated by art, fascinated by books. He had a library that you and I would die for with 40,000 volumes or something. So he just lived there, walk around. And so really interesting guy. And here you have this kind of guy from New York coming down, highly educated, well-read, and, incredibly wealthy, coming to the middle of rural North Carolina, where truly a lot of those families' life had not changed much for them for really since the American Revolution. For a lot of these folks, they were making their own moonshine. They were, making their own clothes, growing their own food, just kind of subsistence level farming and living in the mountains. And a beautiful culture of music. And so kind of, but things that for a lot of these folks up in the mountains, time is sort of frozen. And even the speech that sounds to a lot of us, kind of very backcountry, the kind of thing that, I don't know, the Beverly Hillbillies would make fun of, or, but very, very, is really from Shakespearean England. A lot of the Appalachian speech that sounds to us as very uneducated Deep South. Linguists say is really partly because they've been frozen in time so much. It really kind of goes back to sort of a Shakespearean English that had been preserved because a lot of these folks were so cut off. And so anyway, just fascinating. But, anytime you get that kind of clash of cultures, the super wealthy and the,
right.
Super impoverished and, no running water, no indoor bathrooms, no nothing in these one-room cabins. And then, so anyway, so I'm fascinated, and it's kind of fun to create characters. And you had my husband comes from, or his family comes from southern Italy, and that the Southern Italians were very much feared and discriminated in the 1890s. So that's been kind of fun to have a Southern Italian character. The Italians helped build Biltmore, so that's fun. And then one of my daughters, I have 2 biological kids and 1 adopted, and my adopted child was from China. And again, that was another source of tension, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1890s. So there's this great piece I found about this Chinese character in Asheville in 1895-96. So that character shows up in the novel, and his daughter is part of the novel. So it's fun to find these historical tidbits along the way.
I love it. And I love that. I'm really happy that you're sticking with historical fiction. I love your storytelling, and, and you kept to the language so well. I can't wait to read the next one because I thought it was really good. The language, I don't know. I felt like I was there. You got the accent, you feel like you can hear the accent in it. And so I can't wait. And that is a fascinating time. So much was going on in the country everywhere during that time. So I think that's going to be great. Do you have a timeline for it?
For when it comes out?
Yeah, for when it comes out.
I need to see, first let me get so I hope to finish it, best case scenario, sort of this June. Right? I'm getting to the end, and then you need to go back and, weave in more depth and craft the language better. Thank you for saying that. But I hope, assuming an editor would like to purchase it, I hope it'll sell maybe in summer, early fall, and then usually, unfortunately, publishing can be as long as 2 years, but can happen a little faster. So here's hoping.
Yeah. Oh, well, you know where to find me.
Thank you. You're such a great reader. You're such a good thinker. I love talking to people who really think about books. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I did. I loved, like I said, before we started taping, I read this back when we were supposed to do an interview like a month or 2 ago, and then I reread it, like over the weekend, and then today I just, caught it, and I was like, oh, this is such a good book. And so I was so happy that we finally got to talk. It was fun. And I want to show everybody the cover again, because the cover is so, I saw this cover all over when this came out, and which is how I found you. I was like, I love that cover. Did you, how did you decide on, because I love the color, when the,
and this isn't that, this is an advanced reading copy, unfortunately, but I love in the hardcover, the sort of the purple heatherish hues come out better, but they did a beautiful job of getting the heron, which, as you know, is a significant symbol in the historical and the President Day story. And then they did the artist did these wonderful tangled vines, which I love. And of course the marshes, the Blackwater swamps, as one of the characters is trying to escape through the Blackwater swamp. So I love what they did with it. And it's
so beautiful. Show everybody the mug. I love the mug too.
This has been fun. Can you see it very soon? They come in blue and black.
I love it.
They made for the launch party to give to people who came to the launch party at Parnassus Books, which is our indie bookstore here in Nashville, one of ours. And that we've had fun with these, and they're They're great finds. I'll have to send you one, Michelle, if you'll send me your address. But these are
I love it.
these are good.
I love
But it
puns.
makes me a little tired to look at them because I'm thinking 20 years.
Oh, I know. But isn't, I think it worked out. That's why I wanted you to tell everybody the story because it couldn't have been more perfect. I mean, what a story, for a book. It's crazy. And so, anyway, everybody go buy her book. I will have all the links listed below. And you have a great website. And I'll have the Amazon where you can go right there, push the button, get the book. And we'll talk soon. As soon as your book comes out, please, or, before it comes out. And then we'll do a little, like, we'll post it when it comes out. So I can't wait.
Just such a great to get to talk to you.
Yes, have a great Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. You have a
Okay.
great day.
All right. Bye-bye. Everyone for watching that interview. She was so sweet. You guys have to get this book. I mean, the history, it was crazy good. She did her research, and then, of course, that it lined up with the 2015 shooting. It is woven into the book beautifully. So thank you so much, Joy. I am so happy that we finally got to do this interview. All of her links will be listed below.